My wife and brother left me for dead with a swamp. Now I have $18.3 million, and they have nothing. Here's why. I stood in the parking lot of Sterling and Associates, staring at the glass tower like it was some kind of modern-day guillotine. My Ford F-150 looked pathetic next to all those Teslas and BMWs. The truck was a 2012 model, and honestly, it showed every single one of those miles. Rust bloomed along the wheel wells like some kind of automotive disease. The paint had faded from blue to something closer to sad gray, but it was paid off, and that was more than I could say about most things in my life at that moment. I patted my jeans pocket. My Chase debit card sat there like a ticking time bomb. $1,200. That was it. That was everything I had after Dad's funeral expenses, after the hospital bills, after everything. I had an old JanSport backpack slung over one shoulder, stuffed with Dad's field notebooks. The leather covers were cracked and stained, filled with his chicken scratch handwriting and sketches that most people would think came from a madman. The automatic doors whooshed open, and I felt the blast of air conditioning hit my face. Miami in August is like living inside someone's armpit, so the cold air should have been a relief. Instead, it just made me shiver. The lobby was all marble and chrome, the kind of place where even the elevator music probably cost more than my truck. Mark was waiting by the reception desk. My older brother, the golden child. He wore a suit that probably cost $3,000, and his hair was styled in that way that rich guys do, where it looks effortlessly perfect, but actually requires a team of professionals and expensive products. He glanced at me and I saw it. That look, the same look he'd given me since we were kids. Like I was something he'd scraped off his shoe. He did not shake my hand. He just nodded toward the elevators and told me we were already late. Brenda was upstairs. Our sister, the peacekeeper. The one who always tried to smooth things over between Mark and me, even though she'd clearly chosen sides years ago. The conference room was on the 14th floor, and it had windows that looked out over Biscayne Bay. Sailboats dotted the water like little white triangles. Brenda sat at the long mahogany table, her hands folded. She gave me a tight smile. Vanessa, my wife, sat 2 chairs down from her. That should have been my first clue. She did not sit next to me. She did not even look at me when I walked in. The lawyer, some guy named Patterson with silver hair and reading glasses on a chain, spread out the documents like he was dealing cards in a poker game. Dad's will, the thing we'd all been waiting for, even though nobody wanted to admit it. Patterson cleared his throat and started reading in that monotone lawyer voice that makes everything sound equally boring and terrifying. Mark got $2 million and controlling interest in the lumber mills. Dad had built those mills from nothing, starting back in the 70s when you could still make real money in timber. They were not glamorous, but they were profitable. Steady income, the kind of thing that keeps generating money even when you're sleeping. Brenda got $2 million and the commercial properties in Tallahassee, 3 strip malls and a small office complex. Again, not exciting, but solid. The kind of assets that financial advisors dream about. Passive income, appreciating real estate, all that good stuff. And me? I got parcel 402, 340 acres of Louisiana wetlands, about 2 hours northwest of New Orleans. Patterson described it as undeveloped land with environmental restrictions. Mark actually laughed when he heard that. Not a chuckle, a full laugh. He told me I could not even build a decent bathroom out there because of wetland protection laws. I let my face fall. I let my shoulders slump. I stared at the table like my whole world had just collapsed, which is exactly what they expected to see. Inside, though, I was doing calculations. I was thinking about Dad's notebooks. I was thinking about the company he'd quietly created, Eden's Debt LLC, which he'd used to funnel money into that swamp for the last 12 years. Mark leaned back in his chair, and it made that expensive leather creaking sound. He explained to me, with all the patience of someone talking to a child, that Dad had clearly lost his mind toward the end. All that money poured into a swamp, trying to grow tropical trees in Louisiana, for God's sake. Agarwood trees. Nobody in America even knew what those were. Mark said Dad had been chasing some fantasy, Some pipe dream about creating a domestic source for some exotic wood that nobody cared about. Brenda at least tried to be sympathetic. She touched my arm and said maybe I could sell the land eventually, once the market improved. Maybe some developer would want it someday. She was trying to be kind, but I could hear the pity in her voice. Poor Arthur. Always a screw-up. Always getting the short end of the stick. Vanessa still had not looked at me. She was studying her fingernails like they were the most interesting thing in the world. Patterson slid more papers across the table. Estate taxes, transfer documents, all the boring bureaucratic stuff that comes with death and inheritance. Mark and Brenda signed their documents quickly, efficiently. They knew what they were doing. Mark probably reviewed his papers 3 times before Dad even died. Vanessa had not looked at me for the entire meeting. That should have told me something, but I was too focused on the will to notice. The last week had been strange. She'd moved into the guest bedroom the day after Dad's funeral. Said she needed space. Said she was processing grief. Her phone buzzed constantly with texts she would not let me see. I'd catch her whispering on calls in the backyard, hanging up quick when I walked outside. I thought maybe she was talking to her sister. I thought maybe she was dealing with her own stuff. I was stupid. Patterson pulled out another set of documents. He said there was a related property matter that needed to be resolved before the estate could be finalized. A quitclaim deed, already prepared by Vanessa's attorney, already typed up. All it needed was my signature. Vanessa would get the house, free and clear. In exchange, I would get sole ownership of Parcel 402, no strings attached, no joint ownership, no future claims. Everything clean. Divorce papers were clipped to the back. Filed 3 days ago. I must have been served while I was making funeral arrangements and just never noticed. Or maybe she'd pay to have them filed without personal service. Either way, it was done. I should have fought it. That is what a normal person would do. Lawyer up. Demand a proper division of assets. Make everyone's life difficult for the next year or 2. But I was not interested in the house. I had never really been interested in the house. Vanessa had picked it out. Vanessa had decorated it. Vanessa had filled it with furniture from stores I could not afford and artwork I did not understand. I picked up the pen. It was one of those heavy, expensive pens that lawyers keep on their desks to make signing documents feel more important. I signed the quitclaim deed. I watched Vanessa's face relax. I watched Mark smile. Brenda looked relieved, like she was glad the awkward part was over. Patterson notarized everything right there. He had one of those embossing stamps that makes an official-looking seal on the paper. Very official, very final. The house was gone. My marriage was gone. All I had left was a swamp in Louisiana that everyone thought was worthless. Mark stood up and straightened his tie. He told me, not unkindly, that I should think about getting a real job now. Maybe something in construction, manual labor, something that did not require too much thinking. He said he could make some calls if I wanted. He knew some guys who were always looking for workers. I thanked him. I actually thanked him. I told him I appreciated the offer, and I would think about it. Brenda hugged me on the way out. It was one of those side hugs that people give when they feel obligated but do not really want to touch you. She whispered that she was sorry about Vanessa, and that things would get better eventually. Vanessa left without saying goodbye. She walked out with her purse tucked under her arm, her heels clicking on the marble floor. I watched her go. I waited for some feeling. Sadness, anger, something. But there was nothing, just a kind of cold emptiness. Or maybe relief. It is hard to tell the difference sometimes. Mark shook Patterson's hand and mentioned something about golf next weekend. They laughed about something I did not hear. Then Mark turned to me one more time. He said, almost as an afterthought, that I should not bother trying to develop Parcel 402. Wetlands regulations would crush me. Environmental impact studies alone would cost more than the land was worth. Better to just sit on it and hope for a miracle. Or maybe donate it to some conservation group for a tax write-off. Of course, I did not have any income to write off anymore, so that probably would not help. I nodded. I agreed with everything he said. I acted like a man who just lost everything and knew it. I shuffled toward the elevator with my backpack and my dying phone and my rusted truck waiting in the parking lot. The elevator ride down felt longer than it should have. 14 floors of mirrors and soft music. My shoulders ached under the weight of the backpack. My eyes burned from lack of sleep, like someone had poured sand from a skein, bathed directly into them. The fluorescent lights made everything feel artificial and cold. But inside, I was running numbers. I was thinking about Dad's notebooks, currently stuffed in my backpack. I was thinking about the maps he'd drawn, showing every single tree he'd planted. 340 acres. 12 years of secret work. Trees that nobody knew about except me and Dad. Trees that he'd infected with a very specific fungus, Phylophora parasitica, the black gold of the perfume world. Most people think expensive perfume comes from flowers or chemicals. They are wrong. The most expensive scent in the world comes from infected wood, agarwood, oud. When certain trees get sick with the right fungus, they produce a resin to fight the infection. That resin turns a pale with dark and fills it with a smell that people have been obsessing over for thousands of years. Rich people in Dubai pay more for quality oud than they pay for gold. Luxury brands like Tom Ford and Gucci buy it by the kilogram and turn it into perfumes that cost $500 an ounce. Dad had figured this out 20 years ago. He'd studied it, researched it, traveled to Southeast Asia to learn from people who've been growing agarwood for generations. Then he'd come back to Louisiana and started his own secret grove. He'd told Mark and Brenda he was investing in timber. He'd told them he was diversifying. He'd let them think he was going senile, spending money on some hippie environmental project. But he'd told me the truth. Not all of it, not at first. But piece by piece, over the last 5 years, he brought me in. He'd show me the trees. He'd taught me how to identify the infected ones. He'd explained the market. He'd made me promise not to tell anyone until he was gone. The elevator doors opened. I walked through the lobby. The receptionist did not even look up from her computer. I pushed through the glass doors into the afternoon heat. It felt like walking into a wall of wet cotton. Miami in August is not just hot. It is aggressive about it. My truck sat there in the corner of the lot, surrounded by luxury cars like a mutt at a dog show. I unlocked it with the key because, of course, the electronic fob had stopped working months ago. The interior smelled like old coffee and the pine tree air freshener that had been hanging from a mirror since 2019. I tossed my backpack onto the passenger seat. The notebooks shifted inside with a papery rustle. I sat behind the wheel and just breathed for a minute. The steering wheel was hot enough to burn my hands, so I waited. I watched the Tesla pull out of its spot and glide silently away. I watched Mark's Mercedes follow a minute later, all black paint and tinted windows. Then Brenda's Lexus. Then a car I did not recognize, probably Vanessa's new lawyer, or maybe just someone else having the worst day of their life. I pulled Dad's main notebook out of the backpack. The leather was sweat-stained and soft. I opened it to the marked page, the one with the inventory list. Dad's handwriting was terrible, but I'd spent enough time with him to decode it. 218 trees, carefully tracked. GPS coordinates for each one. Age, infection status, expected resin content. He'd estimated, conservatively, that we could harvest about 400 pounds of high-grade agarwood resin. Maybe more if we were careful. Maybe less if we screwed it up. The international market price for premium wildcrafted agarwood was somewhere between $20,000 and $50,000 per kilogram. For the really good stuff, the kind that made perfume houses literally salivate, prices went even higher. Do the math. 400 pounds is roughly 180 kilograms. Even at the conservative price of $20,000 per kilogram, that is $3.6 million. But that assumed we could only get the lowest grade. Dad's trees were infected with a particularly aggressive strain. The resin was dark, pure. It smelled like a cathedral made of smoke and honey. That kind of oud goes for $50,000 per kilogram, sometimes more if you find the right buyer. I closed the notebook. I started the truck, and it coughed to life like it always did, sounding like it might not make it another mile. But it would. It always did. I pulled out of the parking lot, and onto Brickell Avenue. Traffic was thick. Everyone was heading somewhere. Everyone had places to be. I did not go home. There was no home anymore. Instead, I drove to a storage unit I'd rented 3 months ago, back when I knew this day was coming. It was one of those climate control places with orange doors and keypads. Unit 237. Inside, I'd already stashed the essentials. Camping gear, tools, a waterproof case with all of Dad's detailed maps and analysis reports, a burner laptop with research files, everything I'd need for what came next. I transferred the notebooks from my backpack to the waterproof case. I locked everything up. I stood there in the fluorescent light of the storage hallway and let myself smile. Just a little one. The kind of smile you make when you realize you've been playing chess while everyone else thought you were playing checkers. Mark had the money. Brenda had the property. Vanessa had the house. And I had 340 acres of Louisiana swamp that nobody wanted, filled with trees that nobody knew about, infected with a fungus that would make me richer than all of them combined. They thought I'd lost. They thought I was a family screw-up getting the scraps from Dad's estate. They thought I'd be calling Mark within a month, begging for that construction job, desperate and broken. But I was not broken. I was free. Free from Vanessa's judgment. Free from Mark's condescension. Free from the weight of pretending to be someone I was not. I had a truck, $1,000, and the knowledge that my father had left me something far more valuable than money. He left me revenge served cold. He left me a way to win a game they did not even know they were playing. I climbed back into my truck. The steering wheel had cooled down enough to touch. I pulled out of the storage facility and pointed the F-150 west, toward Louisiana, toward the swamp, toward Parcel 402, toward 340 acres of black gold that smelled like temples and tasted like victory. The sun was setting behind me, turning the Miami skyline orange and pink. Pretty colors for an ugly city. I'd lived there for 15 years, and I would not miss a single day of it. Mark could have his glass towers. Vanessa could have her picture-perfect house. Brenda could have her strip malls. I had a swamp and a secret and a plan. And for the first time in months, maybe years, I felt something that was not numbness or obligation or quiet desperation. I felt alive. I felt focused. I felt like maybe Dad had been right about me all along. The highway stretched out ahead. Interstate 10 would take me straight there. 8 hours if I drove through the night. The truck's gas tank was half full. I had enough money for fuel and food. I had Dad's notebooks. I had time. Nobody was expecting me anywhere. Nobody was waiting for me. Nobody would even notice I was gone until the phone bills stopped getting paid. I reached over and pulled out one more thing from the backpack, a small manila envelope, sealed with packing tape. Inside was a copy of the deed to Parcel 402. My name, my land. No liens, no co-owners, no strings attached. Mark had insisted on the clean separation. He wanted to make sure I could not come back later and claim any part of the real inheritance. He'd gotten exactly what he wanted, and so had I. I thought about calling someone, maybe a friend, maybe one of the guys I used to work with before I'd quit to take care of Dad during his last months. But I did not have anyone to call. Vanessa had been my social coordinator. She'd made the friends. She'd organized the dinners. She'd kept the calendar. Without her, I'd just been floating, going through motions, waiting for this moment. Now the moment was here. The starting gun had fired, and I was already miles ahead while they were still celebrating at the finish line of a race they thought they'd won. The truck's radio did not work right. It caught static more than stations. But somewhere around the Florida-Alabama line, I found a country station that came in clear. Some song about a guy leaving town with nothing but a guitar and a dream. Typical country stuff, but it felt appropriate. I was leaving town with nothing but a truck and a secret. I stopped for gas in Pensacola. The station was one of those big travel centers with a subway and a gift shop full of things nobody needs. I filled the tank and bought a large coffee and a sandwich wrapped in plastic. The coffee tasted like burnt tires, but it was hot and caffeinated, which was all that mattered. Behind the counter, The clerk was watching some reality show on a small TV. People yelling at each other in a mansion somewhere. The clerk did not even look at me when she took my card. She swiped it, and I held my breath, waiting to see if that last $1,000 would be enough. The machine beeped. Transaction approved. I had about $900 left. I ate the sandwich in the truck. Turkey and cheese. It tasted like paper and salt. But I was not eating for pleasure. I was eating for fuel. I had a long night ahead of me. Long weeks, actually. Maybe months. The work waiting for me in Louisiana was not going to be easy. Harvesting agarwood is not like cutting regular timber. You have to be precise. You have to know what you are doing. You have to be patient. Lucky for me, I'd spent the last 5 years learning. Every weekend I could spare, I'd driven out to Louisiana with Dad. He'd taught me everything. How to find the infected trees. How to test the resin content. How to cut without destroying the valuable parts. How to cure the wood properly. How to avoid the environmental regulations that would shut down the whole operation if any one official found out what we were doing. Dad had been smart. He'd structured Eden's Debt as an ecological restoration company. On paper, we were restoring native wetland ecosystems. We had permits. We had environmental impact statements. We had approval from 3 different state agencies. Everything legal. Everything documented. What the agencies did not know was that some of those native trees we were planting just happened to be a very specific species that, when infected with very specific fungus, produce one of the most valuable natural substances on Earth. The paperwork listed them as Aquilaria crasna. Technical. Boring. Nobody at the Department of Environmental Quality knew what that meant. They just saw trees being planted in a wetland and stamped the permits with approval. I crossed into Louisiana sometime after midnight. The highway was empty. Just me and the occasional semi-truck, hauling goods through the darkness. The landscape changed gradually. Less pine trees. More cypress. The air started to smell different, even through the truck's closed windows. Wetter. Older. Like the land itself was rotting and being reborn at the same time. I pulled off the highway near Lafayette and found a rest area. There were a few other vehicles parked there, families sleeping in their cars, truckers taking mandatory rest breaks. I reclined the seat as far as it would go and tried to sleep. It did not work great. The seat was not designed for comfort, and my mind would not stop running calculations. How long to harvest everything? How to extract the resin? Who to contact about selling it? Dad had some connections, old contacts from his research days. People in Vietnam. People in the Middle East. People who dealt in rare materials and did not ask too many questions about origin certificates. But I would need to be careful. Agarwood trafficking is a real thing. International regulations are strict. If I got caught selling unregulated wildcrafted oud, I could end up in federal prison. That is where Dad's genius really showed. He'd not just planted the trees. He'd documented everything. He'd registered Eden's Debt with CITES, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. He'd gotten the permits. He'd filed the reports. Everything was legal. Technically, we were cultivating agarwood on private land for commercial purposes. Completely legitimate. The fact that it was worth millions and nobody knew about it was just good business planning. I gave up on sleep around 4 in the morning. I bought more coffee from a vending machine. It was even worse than the gas station coffee. I did not care. I was too close now. Another 2 hours and I'd be there. Parcel 402. The swamp. The future. The sun came up somewhere around Lake Charles. Orange light spilling across the highway. The kind of sunrise that makes you think maybe everything is going to be okay. Maybe you made the right choice. Maybe you are not crazy after all. I found the turnoff at exactly 6:47 a.m. A gravel road that looked like it led to nowhere. There was a rusted gate with a chain and padlock. I had the key. Dad had given it to me 2 years ago, made me promise to keep it somewhere safe. I kept it on my keyring, hidden among the other keys, looking like nothing important. The iron was warm from my palm as I unlocked the gate. The metal had worn smooth from years of Dad's hands turning it, and now mine. The chain rattled as I unwound it, heavy and cold despite the morning heat. I drove through. The gravel crunched under the tires. Trees closing on both sides. Cypress and tupelo, their roots visible in the shallow water that covered the ground. This was technically wetlands. This was technically protected. This was technically worthless for development. But hidden in here, scattered across 340 acres, were 218 trees that were going to change my life. I drove until the road ended. Then I parked the truck and just sat there for a minute. The engine ticked as it cooled. Birds called from somewhere in the trees. The air smelled like mud and decay and something else. Something sweeter. Something that reminded me of incense and old books and money. I grabbed Dad's notebook. I opened it to the first coordinates. Tree number 1. Planted in 2013. Infected in 2015. Estimated resin content. High. I stepped out of the truck and smiled. For the first time since Dad died, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. I stood there next to tree number 1 for maybe 10 minutes, just breathing. The air smelled different here. Thicker, like the earth itself was exhaling something ancient and organic. Cypress roots twisted up through the shallow water around my boots. Somewhere in the canopy, a barred owl called out even though it was full daylight. This was my inheritance. This was my future. This was 340 acres that everyone thought was worthless. The first week was all reconnaissance. I walked every square foot of property with Dad's notebooks and a handheld GPS unit I bought at a pawn shop for $40. The GPS was older than my marriage and had a crack screen, but it worked. I marked each tree Dad had planted, checked the infection status, took samples. The work was slow and methodical, and I loved every second of it. But loving it did not make it easy. The mosquitoes were biblical. They did not just bite. They swarmed. They got in my ears, my nose, my mouth. I'd wake up in my tent with my face swollen, like I'd gone 10 rounds with a heavyweight boxer. Bug spray helped for about 15 minutes before the sweat washed it off. I learned to work in long sleeves, even when it was 95 degrees. I learned to move slowly so I would not overheat. I learned that the human body can adapt to almost anything if you give it no other choice. The tent was a cheap 2-person Coleman I'd picked up at a Walmart on the way in. It leaked when it rained. The ground was never quite dry, so everything smelled like mildew within 3 days. I had a sleeping bag that was rated for 50 degrees, which meant I froze at night when the temperature dropped and cooked during the day when the sun hit the tent. But it was mine. It was private. It was better than sleeping in my truck, which I would not have for much longer anyway. I sold the F-150 2 weeks in, drove it to a used car lot in Thibodaux, and took the first offer they gave me, $4,500. The salesman looked at the rust and the worn tires and the check engine light that had been on for 2 years, and he offered me $4,000. I countered with $5. We settled at $4,500. Cash. He counted it out in hundreds while I signed the title over. I used $2,000 to buy a flat-bottom aluminum boat with a 15-horsepower Vinrud outboard that looked like it had survived Vietnam. The engine smoked when it started and made a sound like a garbage disposal eating silverware, but it ran. That was all that mattered. The wetlands were easier to navigate by water than by foot. Some of Dad's trees were on islands I could only reach by boat. Another $800 went to a used steel chainsaw and maintenance supplies. Oil, gas, spare chains, a sharpening kit. The chainsaw was older than me, but built like it could cut through a tank. German engineering, the kind of tool that outlasts its owner if you take care of it. The rest went to food and camping supplies. I bought in bulk at a discount grocery store. Canned beans, canned soup, instant rice, peanut butter, crackers, things that would not spoil in the heat, things I could eat cold if I had to. I set up a propane camping stove on a wooden platform I built near my tent. 2 burners. I could boil water for coffee or heat up a can of chili. It was not much, but it was enough. The work itself was meditative once I figured out the rhythm. Agarwood harvesting is nothing like regular logging. You cannot just cut down a tree and drag it to a mill. The valuable part is a resin, the infected heartwood that forms when the tree gets sick. You have to be surgical about it. Precise. Respectful, almost. I would start by cutting away the outer sapwood. The white part, the healthy part. It smelled like regular wood, clean and fresh, like a lumberyard. But as I cut deeper, the smell would change. Darker, richer. Then I would hit the infected zone, and the whole world would shift. The scent of good agarwood is impossible to describe if you have never experienced it. It is smoke and honey. It is old churches and expensive leather. It is sweet but not cloying, dark but not oppressive. It is the smell of something ancient and sacred being pulled from the earth. The first time I hit a really good pocket of resin, I actually stopped working and just stood there breathing it in. It was intoxicating, not in a drug sense, in a spiritual sense, like I was cutting into something holy. Dad's notes were detailed but not perfect. Some trees he thought were heavily infected turned out to be mostly clean. Others he had marked as marginal produced resin so dark and fragrant it looked like melted chocolate. I learned to trust my nose more than his notes. I learned to read the bark patterns, the way it would split, the color of the sawdust. Every tree taught me something. I worked from dawn until dark, sometimes longer if the moon was bright enough. I had a headlamp I wore strapped to my forehead, and I would keep cutting by its beam until my arms gave out. Then I would drag the resin-soaked wood back to my camp, clean it, sort it, wrap it in plastic sheeting to preserve the scent. The pile grew slowly. 20 pounds, 50 pounds, 100 pounds. For months, that was the timeline Dad had calculated. For months to harvest the best trees before the rainy season made the swamp impassable. For months before Mark and Brenda started asking questions about what I was doing with my worthless inheritance. For months before Vanessa's lawyers came sniffing around looking for hidden assets they could claim in the divorce. I lost weight, not in a healthy way, in a way that made my ribs visible and my pants fall off my hips. I had to punch new holes in my belt with a screwdriver because I could not afford to buy a smaller one. My hands developed calluses on top of calluses. My forearms looked like they belonged to someone who did manual labor for a living, which I guess they did now. My face got so sunburned and then tanned that I looked like a different person. Someone harder. Someone older. Someone who had decided to stop apologizing for existing. I did not talk to anyone for weeks at a time. There was no self-service out there. No internet. No connection to the outside world, except for occasional trips to town for supplies. I would load up the boat, motor downstream to where I could access a gravel road, walk 2 miles to the nearest gas station, and buy whatever I needed. The clerk at the gas station stopped asking me questions after the first few visits. I think I scared her. I looked like I was living in the woods. I was living in the woods. People avoid eye contact with guys like me. The ones who look like they have nothing left to lose. The ones who smell like swamp water and with smoke and desperation. I would stand in the fluorescent light of the gas station, picking out the cheapest version of everything, counting my remaining cash, and I would see other customers give me a wide berth, like poverty was contagious, like failure might rub off on them if they got too close. I did not care. I had a purpose. I had a plan. I had a growing stockpile of the most expensive natural material on earth sitting in plastic wrap bundles back at my camp. Every day, I was one step closer to the kind of wealth that would make Mark's $2 million look like pocket change. Every day, I was proving that Dad had not been crazy. Every day, I was becoming the person I was supposed to be. But then, everything almost fell apart. It was a Tuesday morning, middle of my 3rd month. I was working on tree 72, about half a mile from my camp. The tree was a monster, one of Dad's earliest plantings, and the infection had spread through almost the entire trunk. I was cutting carefully, trying not to waste any of the good wood, when I heard the boat motor, not my boat, someone else's, coming closer. I stopped the chainsaw. The silence was immediate and total, except for the fading buzz of the motor. My first thought was that Mark had sent someone, a surveyor maybe, or a lawyer, someone to document that I was living on the property and try to use it against me in some legal maneuver I had not anticipated. My second thought was that I should run. Hide the chainsaw. Hide the evidence. Make it look like I was just camping. But then I realized how stupid that was. This was my land. I had every right to be here. I had every right to harvest timber from my own property. But did I have the right permits? Did I have the environmental clearances? Did I have documentation that these trees were legally planted and not some protected species I was illegally harvesting? I did not know. Dad had always been vague about the paperwork. He had said it was taken care of. He had said Eden's debt was fully licensed. But Dad was dead, and I had no idea where those papers were, or if they even existed. The boat came around a bend in the channel. It was an official-looking vessel, white hull with green trim. I saw the state seal before I saw the person driving it. Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries. My stomach dropped into my boots. The woman who stepped off the boat was maybe 40. Dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. Khaki uniform with patches and a badge. Aviator sunglasses. She moved with the confidence of someone who had authority and knew how to use it. She took in the scene slowly. My chainsaw, the fallen tree, the piles of wood wrapped in plastic, my tent in the background, me, standing there in filthy clothes with sawdust in my beard, looking exactly like someone who was doing something illegal. She introduced herself as Helena Russo, Wildlife and Fisheries. She said she had received a report of unauthorized timber harvesting in a protected wetland area. She asked me if I was aware that this property was subject to environmental restrictions. She asked me if I had the proper permits. I told her my name. I told her this was my land. I showed her the deed, which I kept in a waterproof folder in my tent. She examined it. She did not seem impressed. She said ownership did not exempt me from state and federal environmental regulations. She said wetlands were protected. She said harvesting trees without proper assessment could result in fines up to $50,000 per violation. She asked me again about permits. This was it. This was the moment that would determine everything. I could lie. I could try to talk my way out of it. I could claim ignorance. But I had spent 4 months in this swamp learning to trust my instincts, and my instincts told me that Helena Russo was not someone who responded well to bullshit. So I told her the truth. Not all of it, but enough. I told her my father had planted these trees. I told her he had been researching sustainable agarwood cultivation. I told her these trees were not native but were not invasive. I told her Dad had registered them with state environmental authorities years ago through a company called Eden's Debt. I told her I was continuing his work. She took off her sunglasses. Her eyes were brown and sharp. She asked me if I knew what agarwood was. I said yes. She asked me if I knew what it was worth. I said yes. She asked me if I understood that agarwood was regulated under CITES, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. I said I was aware. Then she did something I did not expect. She asked if she could see the wood. I showed her one of the better pieces, a section of heartwood about the size of a football, so dark it was almost black, so saturated with resin you could see it gleaming in the sunlight. She picked it up. She smelled it. Her expression changed. Not suspicious anymore. Curious. Almost reverent. She asked me where I learned to identify quality oud. I told her my father taught me. She asked me where my father learned. I told her he spent 2 years in Vietnam and Cambodia studying traditional cultivation methods. She asked me if he kept records. I said yes. She asked if she could see them. I brought out Dad's notebooks. All of them. Field journals dating back 15 years. Sketches. GPS coordinates. Infection protocols. Growth rates. Environmental impact assessments. Species compatibility studies. It was not just a hobby project. It was a lifetime of research. It was scientific. It was thorough. It was legitimate. Helena sat on an overturned bucket and read for an hour. I did not interrupt. I just stood there, watching her process everything, knowing that this woman held my entire future in her hands. If she decided I was breaking the law, I was finished. If she decided Dad had been running some kind of illegal operation, everything I had worked for would be confiscated. 4 months of labor would disappear into evidence lockers. But if she decided we were doing something legal, something valuable, something worth protecting. She closed the last notebook. She looked at me for a long time. Then she said something I will never forget. She said my father was not crazy. She said what he had done here was remarkable. She said most people trying to cultivate agarwood in the United States had failed because they did not understand ecology. They treated it like a cash crop instead of a long-term restoration project. They cut corners. They ignored the environmental impact. They created problems instead of solving them. But Dad had not done that. Dad had integrated the agarwood trees into the existing wetland ecosystem. He had chosen species that could tolerate flooding. He had spaced them properly. He had monitored the water quality. He had created something sustainable, something that actually improved the habitat instead of destroying it. Helena said she was an ecologist before she became an enforcement officer. She said she had written her master's thesis on wetland restoration. She said what Dad had built here was exactly the kind of project environmental agencies should be supporting instead of regulating to death. Then she asked me the big question. She asked me if I had sites documentation. She asked me if I had export permits. She asked me if I had any legal framework to actually sell what I was harvesting. I said no. I said I had been planning to figure that out after I finished the harvest. I said I knew it was backwards, but I did not have the money to hire lawyers before I had anything to sell. She shook her head, not in disappointment, in something like sympathy. She said I was about to make the same mistake hundreds of small-scale producers made. She said I could have the best product in the world, and it would not matter if I could not legally sell it. She said international buyers would not touch unregulated oud. She said legitimate perfume houses would laugh me out of their offices. She said I would end up selling to black market dealers who would pay me 10% of what the product was worth and expose me to criminal liability. Then she offered to help. She said she could not officially help. She said it would be a conflict of interest, but she said she could point me in the right direction. She said she knew people at the state agriculture department who handled sites permits. She said she knew the forms I needed to fill out. She said she knew the testing requirements. She said she knew the fees. The fees. That word made my chest tight. I asked her how much. She said it depended on the documentation, but probably between $500 and $1,000, plus lab testing for species verification, plus inspection fees, plus processing time that could take anywhere from 3 to 6 months. I had maybe $700 left to my name. That was it. That was all that stood between me and absolute poverty. But without proper documentation, I had nothing. I had 4 months of work that I could not legally sell. I had a fortune in agarwood that was worthless without papers. I made the decision in about 5 seconds. I told Helena I would do whatever it took. I asked her what I needed to do first. She spent the next 3 hours walking me through the process. We sat in my tent with Dad's notebooks and her laptop, which she had brought from her boat. She had a mobile hotspot, so we actually had internet for the first time in months. We filled out forms. We documented the species. We photographed the trees. We created a detailed inventory. We wrote a cultivation and harvest plan. We outlined the environmental protections Dad had built into the system. Helena knew exactly what the state agencies wanted to see. She knew the language to use. She knew the boxes to check. She knew how to frame agarwood cultivation as an ecological benefit instead of an environmental threat. She was not just helping me. She was teaching me. She was giving me the tools to do this right. By the time she left, I had a complete application packet ready to submit. She said she could not promise anything. She said the approval process was legitimate, and I would have to meet all the requirements. But she said if everything I told her was true, if Dad's documentation was accurate, if the environmental impact was as minimal as it appeared, then I had a real chance. She also said something else. She said she hoped I succeeded. She said the world needed more people who care about doing things right instead of just doing things fast. She said her office would be monitoring the property to make sure I stayed in compliance, but that she would be rooting for me. Then she got in her boat and motored away, leaving me standing on the shore with a laptop full of forms and a stack of papers that represented either my salvation or my final mistake. I spent the next week finishing the paperwork. I drove to the nearest town with a FedEx office and shipped everything via certified mail with tracking and signature confirmation. It cost me $43 I could not afford. Then I waited. The approval came back in 8 weeks. Faster than Helena had predicted. The site's permit, the cultivation license, the harvest authorization. Everything stamped and official. I paid the fees with the last $512 I had. My bank account had zero, but I had papers. Legal papers. Papers that said I was not a criminal. Papers that said I owned this product legitimately. Papers that would open doors to real buyers who paid real money. I finished the harvest 6 days later. 183 kilograms of premium agarwood resin. I wrapped it carefully, numbered each bundle, created an inventory that matched my site's documentation, loaded everything into the boat, and transported it to a climate-controlled storage unit I rented in Baton Rouge. The unit cost me $150 a month, which I put on a credit card I had almost maxed out. One more gamble. One more bet on a future that had to work because there was no alternative. I stood in front of that storage unit for a long time after I closed the door. Unit 342. A 10 by 10 space with concrete floors and a rolling door and a padlock I had bought at Home Depot. Inside that unit was everything. 4 months of work. 15 years of Dad's planning. 340 acres of swamp transformed into a concentrated essence, worth more than everything Mark and Brenda had inherited combined. I had sold my truck. I had destroyed my body. I had lived like an animal in the woods. I had taken a chance on a stranger who could have arrested me, but chose to help me instead. I had spent my last dollar on fees and paperwork and shipping costs. But I had done it right. I had done it legal. I had done it the way Dad would have wanted. I locked the padlock. The metal clicked. Final. Secure. Helena had told me before she left that first day that she believed in what I was doing. She had given me her card. She had written her personal cell number on the back. She had said if I ever needed advice on environmental compliance, or if anyone gave me trouble about the permits, I should call her. I looked at that card now, creased and stained from living in my wallet for 2 months. Helena Russo, Wildlife and Fisheries, but also something more. The first person in a year who had looked at me like I was worth something. The first person who had helped me instead of taking from me. The first person who had seen what I was trying to build instead of what I had lost. I walked back to my boat. My camp was already broken down. Tent folded. Gear packed. The swamp looked different now. Empty. Used up, but also saved. Dad's trees were still standing. The ecosystem was intact. I had taken what we needed without destroying what mattered. Mark thought he had won. Brenda thought I had disappeared. Vanessa thought I was broken and gone. They had no idea. They had no concept of what I had just pulled off. They were counting their millions and planning their futures while I was standing in front of a storage unit, holding the keys to something they could not even imagine. I started the boat motor. It coughed and sputtered and caught. Smoke drifted across the brown water. I pointed the bow downstream toward Baton Rouge, toward civilization, toward the next phase of this plan. I was ready for war with my brother, and this time I had the ammunition. The boat motor died halfway to Baton Rouge. Just stopped. 1 second it was coughing along like it always did, and the next it was silent. I sat there in the middle of the channel, drifting with the current, and I actually laughed. Of course it died. Of course the 15-horsepower piece of junk I bought for $2,000 would give up right when I needed it most. That is how these things work. The universe has a sense of humor, and it is not a kind one. I pulled the motor up and checked the fuel line. Clogged. I cleared it with a piece of wire from my toolbox. Primed the bulb. Pulled the starter cord 20 times before it caught. By then I had drifted almost a mile downstream, but I did not care. I was still moving forward. That was all that mattered. I ditched the boat at a public launch near Grostet. Just left it tied to the dock with the key in the ignition. Someone would take it. Someone always takes free boats, even broken ones. I walked 3 miles to the nearest bus stop and caught a Greyhound to Baton Rouge. The bus smelled like diesel and desperation. The woman sitting next to me was talking to herself about Jesus and lottery tickets. I closed my eyes and tried to sleep, but my mind would not stop running calculations. 183 kilograms. International market rates between 20 and 50,000 per kilogram. Conservative estimate, 3.6 million. Realistic estimate, 6 to 8 million. Optimistic estimate, if I found the right buyers, 10 million or more. Those numbers played on repeat in my head, like a song I could not turn off. But I could not sell it yet. Not directly. I needed Mark to think I had nothing. I needed him to think I was still the same broken failure who walked out of that Miami office with a swamp and a broken heart. I needed him hungry. I needed him greedy. I needed him to make a mistake. I spent 2 weeks in Baton Rouge living in a $40 a night motel near the interstate. The kind of place where you do not ask questions and nobody asks you any either. The carpet was stained with things I did not want to identify. The air conditioner rattled like it was trying to escape. The bed was hard as concrete, but it had a door that locked and a bathroom that worked, and that made a palace compared to the tent. I used the motel Wi-Fi to do research. I found out what Mark and Brenda had been doing with their inheritances. Mark had already invested his $2 million into expanding the lumber operations. He was buying equipment, hiring staff, making deals. He had also bought a new house in Coral Gables, something with 5 bedrooms and a pool, right in the neighborhood he had always wanted. Social media showed him at charity galas wearing tuxedos and drinking champagne with people whose names ended in numerals. Brenda had been quieter about her money. She was renovating the strip malls, upgrading facades, replacing roofs, smart investments, boring investments, the kind that would pay off in 10 years but would not make her rich tomorrow. And Vanessa had moved into Mark's old condo downtown, the one he had sold when he bought the big house. She was posting pictures on Instagram, new furniture, new clothes, new life. She looked happy. She looked like someone who had made the right choice by leaving the dead weight behind. I studied those pictures for a long time, not because I missed her. I did not. But because I needed to understand her psychology. I needed to know what would make her react, what would make her scared, what would make her desperate. Then I started planting seeds. Carefully, strategically, like Dad had taught me to plant trees. I created a burner email account and sent an anonymous tip to a local environmental blog. Said there were suspicious geological surveys being conducted on private wetlands in Assumption Parish. Mentioned Parcel 402, mentioned possible methane deposits, did not give enough detail to be credible, but gave enough to be searchable. The blog did not publish it, but that did not matter. I knew Mark had Google alerts set up for anything related to Louisiana natural gas. He was always looking for investment opportunities, always hunting for the next big score. 2 days later, I was at a diner in Thibodaux called the Rusty Anchor. It was the kind of place that served breakfast all day and had coffee that tasted like it was brewed in a boot. The vinyl booth seats were cracked and patched with duct tape. The menu was laminated and sticky. The waitress called everyone honey and remembered nobody's name. I looked the part. I had not shaved in 2 weeks. My clothes were the same ones I had worn in the swamp, still stained with sawdust and mud. My hands were rough and dirty under the fingernails. I looked like someone who was living rough, someone who was barely holding on, someone who was exactly where Mark expected me to be. I ordered coffee and sat by the window where I could see the parking lot. I had a notebook open in front of me, just random numbers and sketches. Nothing that meant anything, but it looked like I was working on something, calculating something, planning something. I made a phone call, loud enough that the couple in the next booth could hear. I pretended to be talking to someone at the Louisiana Department of Natural Resources. I asked about mineral rights assessments. I asked about filing for exploratory drilling permits. I asked about methane extraction regulations in protected wetlands. I made it sound desperate. I made it sound like I was trying to figure out how to hide something. Then I hung up. I paid my check in cash. I left the notebook on the table, just walked out and left it there, like I had forgotten it in my distracted state. Inside the notebook were printouts of geological surveys for Assumption Parish, maps with circles drawn around Parcel 402, estimates of potential methane deposits in Louisiana wetlands. None of it was real. All of it was designed to look like I had stumbled onto something valuable and did not know what to do with it. The waitress would find the notebook. She would probably glance through it. She would mention it to the next customer. Small-town diners are information exchanges. Everyone hears everything eventually, and Mark had people everywhere. He had always been good at networking, at making connections, at keeping his ear to the ground. I was staying at a different motel by then, one in Morgan City. Cheaper, worse, the kind of place where the weekly rate was negotiable if you paid in cash. I waited. I knew it would not take long. It took 4 days. Mark called me. First time I had heard his voice since the estate reading. He sounded friendly. Concerned. He asked me how I was doing. He asked if I needed anything. He said Brenda was worried about me. He said they had heard I was living rough. He said families should stick together during hard times. I played it perfectly. I sounded tired, defeated. I told him I was trying to make something work with the land, but it was harder than I thought. I told him I was running out of money. I told him I did not know what to do. I gave him just enough to make him curious, but not enough to make him certain. He suggested we meet. He said he wanted to talk about options. He said maybe there was a way we could all benefit from the situation. He said he did not want to see me living in motels and eating diner food for the rest of my life. He sounded like he cared. He sounded like a brother who wanted to help. I knew better. I knew exactly what he wanted, but I agreed to meet. I suggested the Rusty Anchor, neutral territory, public place, somewhere that did not scream ambush. He arrived in his Mercedes. Vanessa was with him. That surprised me for about 3 seconds. Then it made perfect sense. Of course she was with him. They were probably together now. Or at least they were working together. 2 people who had decided I was worthless finding common, 'cause in making sure I stayed that way, they walked into the diner like they were touring a zoo. Mark wore business casual, khakis, and a polo shirt that probably cost more than I used to spend on groceries in a month. Vanessa wore white jeans and a silk blouse. She looked like she was on her way to brunch in Coral Gables, not meeting her ex-husband in a diner that smelled like old grease and broken dreams. I stood up when they approached. Old habits. Tried to shake Mark's hand. He took it, but let go quickly, like I might be contagious. Vanessa would not even look at me directly. She slid into the booth across from me and studied the menu like it was written in a foreign language. Mark got right to business. He said he had been hearing things. Rumors. Stories about me asking questions about mineral rights. He said he had also heard that I had been conducting surveys on the property. He wanted to know what was going on. He said it straight. No preamble. No small talk. I let the silence hang for a moment. Then I told him it was nothing. Just exploring options. Try to figure out if there was any way to make the land valuable. I said I had heard that some wetlands in Louisiana had methane deposits. I said I thought maybe if I could prove there were extractable resources on the property, I could get a loan against a future value. Mark leaned back. His lawyer brain was working. I could see it in his eyes. He asked me if I had found anything. I said maybe. I said the preliminary tests were inconclusive. I said I did not have the money to do a proper geological survey. I said I was stuck. That was when Vanessa spoke. She asked me why I had not told anyone. She asked me why I was being secretive. She made it sound like an accusation, like I was hiding something criminal, instead of just trying to survive. I told her I did not want to get anyone's hopes up. I told her I did not want Mark and Brenda, thinking I was trying to renegotiate the estate. I told her I just wanted to figure out if I had anything worth anything before I made any claims. I sounded reasonable. I sounded honest. I sounded like someone who was embarrassed to even be having this conversation. Mark's expression changed. He was calculating. He asked me what I would need to do a full survey. I told him probably $20,000. Maybe more. He asked me where I was going to get that kind of money. I said I did not know. I said I was trying to figure it out. I said maybe I could get a loan if I used the land as collateral. That was when he made his offer. He said he had been thinking. He said maybe the estate division had not been fair. He said maybe Dad had not been thinking clearly when he made the will. He said there were legal options to challenge it. He said if we went to court, the will could be invalidated. He said I could end up with nothing. I let that sink in. I let the threat hang there. Then I asked him what he wanted. He said he wanted to buy the property from me. Clean sale. No complications. He would give me $100,000 cash. I would sign over the deed. We would file a property settlement agreement that would release both parties from any future claims. Simple, easy, fair. I asked him why. Why would he pay $100,000 for a swamp he thought was worthless? He smiled. He said he had connections in the energy sector. He said if there was methane on the property, he could get it developed properly. He said he could handle the regulatory side. He said I could walk away with cash and no liability. He made it sound like he was doing me a favor. I pretended to think about it. I looked at Vanessa. She was watching me with an expression I could not quite read. Maybe pity, maybe contempt, maybe just impatience to get this over with so she could go back to her new life. I told Mark I would do it, but I had conditions. I said I want a full property settlement and release agreement. I said I wanted it in writing, that neither party could come back later with claims about hidden assets or fraud. I said I wanted protection. I said I did not trust lawyers anymore after what happened with the divorce. No offense. Mark agreed immediately. Too quickly. He said that was completely reasonable. He said he would have his firm draw up the papers. He said we could close in a week. He stood up like the meeting was over, like he had already won. I stopped him. I said there was one more thing. I said I wanted the agreement to include an as-is clause. I said I did not want to be responsible for any environmental issues that came up after the sale. I said if he drilled and found contamination or caused ecological damage, I did not want to be liable. I said I had heard stories about wetland violations costing millions in EPA fines. I said I wanted to be clear that once I sold the property, it was his problem, not mine. Mark looked at me like I was an idiot. He said, of course. He said that was standard language in any property transfer. He said, as is meant I was selling with no warranties or guarantees. He said once he owned it, everything that happened on the property was his responsibility. He actually explained it to me like I was too stupid to understand basic legal concepts. He told me it protected me completely. He said I had nothing to worry about. I made him say it again. I made him explain exactly what is meant. I made him confirm that once the sale was complete, I had zero liability for anything that happened on Parcel 402. He confirmed it all. He was patient with me, condescending but patient, like a teacher explaining simple math to a slow student. I agreed. I said I would sign whatever he wanted as long as that clause was in there. Mark shook my hand. This time, he held on a little longer. He thought he had me. He thought he had just pulled off the deal of the year. $100,000 for property that might have millions in methane underneath it. He was probably already calculating the profit margins in his head. Vanessa stood up without saying goodbye. She walked out ahead of Mark. I watched them through the window. They stood by his Mercedes talking. She was smiling. He put his hand on her shoulder. They looked like people who had just won something. They looked like people who thought they were smarter than everyone else. I paid for my coffee. I left a $5 tip for the waitress, even though the bill was $3. I walked out into the parking lot and stood there for a moment, breathing the humid Louisiana air. It smelled like rain coming, like change, like the moment right before everything shifts. The paperwork took 6 days. Mark's law firm was efficient. The property settlement and release agreement was 12 pages long. Dense legal language. Definitions, clauses, subclauses. Right there on page 7 was the section I needed. As is, all caps. The property was being transferred in its current condition with no warranties, express or implied. The buyer acknowledged that they were purchasing the property without any representations from the seller regarding environmental conditions, mineral rights, or future development potential. The buyer assumed all liability for any environmental remediation or regulatory compliance issues arising after the transfer date. I read it 3 times. It was perfect. Mark had written my insurance policy for me. He had created the legal framework that would protect me from everything that was about to happen. I met him at a title company in Baton Rouge. Neutral ground. A bland office with beige walls and uncomfortable chairs. A notary public who looked bored out of her mind. Mark brought a cashier's check for $100,000. I brought the deed to parcel 402 and the keys to the gate. We signed. The notary stamped. The check changed hands. The keys changed hands. The property was his. All 340 acres of Louisiana wetlands that he thought contained methane deposits, and I knew contained nothing but cypress trees and water, and the ecological time bomb Dad had spent 15 years building. Mark shook my hand again. He told me I had made the right choice. He told me this money would help me get back on my feet. He told me to use it wisely. Start over. Find a job. Build a life. All the things older brothers say when they think they have just saved you from yourself. I thanked him. I told him I appreciated his help. I told him I hoped he found what he was looking for on the property. I meant every word. I absolutely hoped he found exactly what he was looking for. I deposited the check that afternoon. $100,000 in my account. More money than I had seen in years. But it was nothing compared to what was sitting in storage unit 342. I drove straight there. Rented a U-Haul truck for $79 a day. Loaded every single bundle of agarwood into back. 183 kilograms of the most valuable natural material on Earth. Locked the truck. Pointed it north. Toward New York. Toward the auction houses. Toward the perfume industry buyers who have been waiting their entire careers for domestic-sourced oud of this quality. The drive took 3 days. I stopped only for gas and bathroom breaks. I slept in the truck at rest areas. I ate gas station food. I did not care. I had spent 4 months living in worse conditions. 3 days in a U-Haul cab was luxury by comparison. New York smelled different than Louisiana. Concrete and exhaust and a million people living on top of each other. I checked into a hotel near Madison Avenue. Not expensive, but not cheap either. The kind of place where business travelers stay. I took a shower that lasted 30 minutes. I shaved for the first time in months. I looked at myself in the mirror and barely recognized the person looking back. I had lost maybe 30 pounds. My face was all angles now. My eyes looked older, harder. My hands were still rough from the chainsaw work, calluses that would not fade for months. But I cleaned up okay. I put on the one suit I owned, the one I had worn at Dad's funeral. It was wrinkled from being folded in my backpack, but it fit better now that I was thinner. The auction house was called Artisan Rarities. They specialized in luxury raw materials, rare woods, precious metals, exotic fibers. Things that wealthy people and corporations bought in bulk to turn into products that other wealthy people would buy at markup. I had contacted them 3 weeks earlier from a burner phone, told them I had domestically cultivated agarwood, sent them photos, sent them sites documentation, sent them Eden's debt registration papers. They had responded within hours. They wanted to see it. They wanted to smell it. They wanted to verify the quality. They had scheduled a private showing before the main quarterly auction. This was standard procedure for high-value lots. Buyers needed time to evaluate. Experts needed time to authenticate. Money needed time to gather. I met with their materials director in a private room that smelled like money, dark wood paneling, leather furniture, track lighting. She was maybe 50, wore a tailored suit that probably cost more than my hotel room, and had the kind of confidence that comes from spending your entire career around valuable things. I showed her the agarwood. She picked up a piece, held it to the light, scratched it with her fingernail, brought it to her nose. Her expression changed. Not dramatic, just a subtle shift. The way an expert looks when they realize they are holding something genuine. She called in 2 more people. One was from LVMH, the luxury conglomerate that owns half the high-end perfume brands in the world. The other was an independent broker who supplied boutique fragrance houses. They each examined the samples. They each smelled them. They each looked at the documentation. Then they started asking questions. Where was it grown? How was it cultivated? What was the infection methodology? How was it harvested? How was it stored? I answered everything honestly. I showed them Dad's notebooks. I showed them the environmental permits. I showed them the site's approval. I showed them 15 years of documented research and cultivation. The LVMH representative asked if I had more. I told him I had 183 kilograms. He did not react visibly, but I saw something flicker in his eyes. That was a significant quantity. That was enough to supply their entire North American operation for years. That was enough to build an entire product line around. He asked me what I wanted for it. I told him I was open to offers. He said he would need to make some calls. He said he would be in touch before the auction. He took 3 samples with him, wrapped them carefully in acid-free tissue paper, carried them like they were made of glass. The auction was 2 days later. The room was smaller than I expected, maybe 40 people, representatives from major brands, independent buyers, brokers, investors, people who dealt in millions of dollars like it was lunch money. I sat in the back and watched the lots go by. Rare sandalwood from India, Cocobolo from Central America, Purple Heart from Brazil. Each lot had a story. Each lot had provenance. Each lot sold for amounts that would have changed my life a year ago. Then they brought out my agarwood, Lot 47. They displayed it on a white cloth under focus lighting. The wood gleamed, almost black, dense with resin. The auctioneer described it as domestically cultivated Louisiana agarwood with full sites documentation and verified grade A quality. He noted that this was the first auction of American-grown oud in the house's history. He noted that the quantity available was substantial. He noted that the seller had additional inventory available for direct purchase after the auction. Bidding started at $5,000 per kilogram. It hit $10,000 within seconds, $20,000 within a minute, $30,000, $40,000. The LVMH representative was bidding. So was a broker for Tom Ford. So was someone from a Middle Eastern investment group. The numbers kept climbing. It settled at $48,000 per kilogram. The broker for Qatari perfume house won with a paddle raise that looked casual but represented a bid of $8.7 million for the entire lot. The room applauded. That was unusual. People do not usually applaud at auctions. But this was historic. This was American agarwood competing with Asian product and winning. This was validation of everything Dad had worked for. But the LVMH representative was not done. He approached me after the auction. He said his company wanted to purchase the remaining inventory. All of it. Whatever I had not included in the auction lot. He said they wanted exclusive rights to American-sourced oud. He said they were prepared to offer $45,000 per kilogram for verified grade A material. He said they would send their quality team to inspect and document everything. He said they could have payment processed within 72 hours. I sold them 93 kilograms for $0.1 million. Combined with the auction sale, I was looking at $12.8 million. After auction house fees and commissions and transport costs, I would clear just under $12 million in 3 days for 4 months of work in a swamp. But I was not done. I still had contacts Dad had made in Vietnam. I still had boutique buyers who wanted small quantities of ultra-premium grade. I still had wood that was too valuable to sell in bulk. Over the next 3 weeks, I moved the remaining inventory, private sales, direct transactions, buyers who understood that what I had was irreplaceable, who understood that American oud might never exist at this quality again. Final total, $18.3 million. I sat in my hotel room and looked at the bank statements on my laptop. The numbers did not feel real. They felt like a mistake, like someone had added too many zeros. Like the whole thing was a fever dream I would wake up from back in my tent being eaten by mosquitoes. But it was real. The money was real. The site's permits were real. The work had been real. The plan had worked. I called Helena, used the number she had written on the back of her card. She answered on the 3rd ring. I told her what had happened. Not all of it, but enough. I told her the Agriwood had sold. I told her the permits she helped me get had worked. I told her I wanted to thank her. She congratulated me. She said she had known the wood was valuable, but had not realized it was that valuable. She asked me what I was going to do now. I told her I did not know yet. I told her I had some things to settle first. She said she understood. She said if I ever needed anything, environmental compliance or otherwise, I should call. I promised I would, and I meant it. 2 weeks later, I got a call from Brenda. She was crying. She said Mark was in trouble. She said he had done something stupid. She said he had brought drilling equipment onto Parcel 402 and started exploratory excavation for methane. She said the drilling had disrupted the water table. She said contamination had spread to neighboring properties. She said the EPA had gotten involved. She said they were facing fines. She said Mark's lawyers were telling him it could be as high as $5 million. She asked me if I knew anything about this. She asked me if I had any idea there were environmental hazards on the property. She asked me if I had hidden anything from Mark when I sold it. I told her the truth. I told her I had sold the property as is. I told her Mark's own lawyers had written that clause into the agreement. I told her that meant Mark had assumed all liability for everything that happened on the land after the transfer. I told her I was sorry she was going through this, but there was nothing I could do. She hung up on me. I did not hear from her again. Mark tried to sue me. His lawyers sent letters. They claimed fraud. They claimed misrepresentation. They claimed I had deliberately concealed environmental hazards. But every claim hit the wall of that as-is clause. The property settlement agreement was ironclad. Mark had signed it. His own firm had written it. He had even explained it to me himself, slowly and carefully, making sure I understood that once the sale was complete, everything was his problem. The lawsuits went nowhere. The EPA fines did not. Mark had destroyed Dad's careful drainage system when he brought in the drilling equipment. The fungus Dad had introduced to create the Agriwood resin was still in the soil. Without the trees to contain it, without the water management system to control it, the fungus spread. It got into the groundwater. It contaminated 2 neighboring properties. It killed fish in a tributary that fed into a recreational lake. The EPA classified it as an environmental disaster. They did not care that Mark had not known about the fungus. They did not care that he thought he was drilling for methane. They cared that he had brought heavy equipment into a protected wetland without proper permits. They cared that he had caused contamination. They cared that he had violated about 12 different environmental regulations. The fines totaled $5.2 million. Mark fought it. He hired environmental lawyers. He hired consultants. He burned through his inheritance fighting the EPA. He lost. The government always wins those fights. Always. He had to sell the lumber mills. He had to sell the new house. He had to liquidate everything. It was not enough. He declared bankruptcy. The kind of bankruptcy that follows you forever. The kind that means you cannot get a business loan for a decade. The kind that means you are done playing in the big leagues. Vanessa called me once, 3 months after everything fell apart. She did not say hello. She just started talking. She said Mark had disappeared. She said he had taken what money he had left and vanished. She said she thought maybe Mexico or Central America, somewhere the bankruptcy courts could not touch him. She said he had promised her he would make everything right. She said he had promised they would get through it together. She said he had lied about everything. She asked me if I had known, if I had planned this, if I had deliberately set Mark up to fail. I did not answer. I just listened to her cry. Then I hung up. I bought a house in Montecito, not a mansion, just a comfortable place with an ocean view and enough land that I did not have to see neighbors. 3 bedrooms, open floor plan, glass doors that open onto a deck where I could watch the sunset. It cost $2.4 million. I paid cash. Helena came to visit 3 months after I moved in. She had taken a new position with a conservation nonprofit. Better hours, better mission. She said enforcement work had been burning her out. She said she wanted to actually help preserve things instead of just punishing people who destroyed them. We sat on the deck and drank wine and watched the sun turn the ocean gold. She asked me if I felt guilty, if I felt bad about what happened to Mark, if I thought I had gone too far. I told her the truth. I told her Mark had gotten exactly what he deserved. He had spent his entire life thinking he was smarter than everyone else. He had spent his entire life taking things that did not belong to him and justifying it with lawyer logic. He had treated me like garbage because he thought I was weak. He had tried to steal from me because he thought I was stupid. But I was not stupid. I was patient. I had learned from Dad. I had learned that real wealth is not about taking. It is about building. It is about understanding systems. It is about playing the long game while everyone else is scrambling for quick wins. Mark had signed that as-is clause thinking he was protecting himself. He had signed it thinking he was buying my land for pennies on the dollar. He had signed it thinking he was the smartest person in the room. He had never considered that maybe, just maybe, I knew exactly what I was doing. That maybe I had learned a few things living in that swamp. That maybe Dad had taught me more than how to identify infected trees. Helena did not judge. She just nodded. She understood. She had spent enough years in enforcement to know that the people who broke the rules were usually the ones who thought the rules did not apply to them. She had seen enough Mark types to know that sometimes the universe has a way of balancing the scales. She stayed for dinner. Then she stayed for the weekend. Then she just kind of never left. Not officially. She still had her apartment in Sacramento. She still had her job. But she spent more and more time in Montecito. More and more time with me. More and more time building something that felt like the future instead of just revenge. 6 months later, we were sitting on that same deck. Morning this time. Coffee instead of wine. The marine layer was burning off, revealing the Channel Islands in the distance. I had my laptop open, reviewing quarterly statements from my investment accounts. $12 million properly invested generates a lot of passive income, enough that I never had to work again if I did not want to. But I was working. I had started a foundation, the Arthur Brennan Environmental Restoration Fund. We gave grants to small projects that focus on sustainable cultivation of rare species. We helped people like Dad, people who had ideas that seemed crazy but were actually brilliant, people who understood that real conservation was not about locking things away, but about learning to use them responsibly. Helena ran the grant selection committee. She knew how to spot legitimate projects. She knew how to identify people who cared about the science instead of just the money. She knew how to build something that would last. An email came in while I was reviewing the financials. Subject line, bankruptcy proceedings, Mark Brennan, final report. I almost did not open it. I had stopped following Mark's situation months ago. But curiosity got the better of me. The report was from the bankruptcy trustee. It detailed the final disposition of Mark's assets. Total liabilities, $7.3 million. Total assets, $1.1 million. The mills had sold for less than expected. The house had sold in a down market. The legal fees had consumed everything else. Mark was officially broke. The report noted that his whereabouts were unknown and that the trustee had closed the case. Mark Brennan was done. Finished. Erased from the business world like he had never existed. I closed the laptop. Helena asked me what I was looking at. I told her it was nothing important. Just old business getting resolved. She did not push. She understood that some doors need to stay closed once you walk through them. I stood up and walked to the railing. The ocean was calm. The air smelled like salt and eucalyptus. Somewhere down the beach, people were walking their dogs, living their lives, unaware that $18 million was sitting in accounts attached to the guy watching them from a deck in Montecito. I thought about Dad, about the notebooks, about tree number 1 and the way the agarwood had smelled when I first cut into it, about standing in that office in Miami watching Mark smile while Vanessa signed divorce papers, about sleeping in a tent being eaten by mosquitoes, about Helena showing up in her official boat thinking I was a criminal and choosing to help me instead of arrest me. I thought about Mark signing that as-is clause, explaining it to me like I was too dumb to understand, taking the keys to Parcel 402 like he had just won the lottery. never imagining that he was holding a ticking bomb, never considering that maybe the crazy old man's son had learned a thing or two about patience and planning and revenge. Helena came up behind me, put her hand on my shoulder, asked me if I was okay. I told her I was better than okay. I told her I was exactly where I was supposed to be. I told her that sometimes the universe takes a long time to balance the scales, but when it does it perfectly. I closed the folder with Mark's bankruptcy report, filed it away in a drawer I would probably never open again. The air was clean, the view was perfect, and the scent of my betrayal was as sweet as the finest grade of Kinham agarwood, aged 15 years in Louisiana soil, harvested by hands that learned to be patient, and sold to people who understood that some things are worth waiting for. The war was over. I had won, and Mark would spend the rest of his life never quite understanding how.